To my immediate left is Soraya de Chadarevian, a history of science with a special emphasis in biology, philosophy, and the history of medicine. To my left, at the far end, is Barbara Natterson-Horowitz, who is an evolutionary medicine specialist who has written an unusual book about zoobiquity, which shows the relationship between animal and human health patterns. To start, Barbara?
Great. Well, first of all, I want to thank our speakers for expanding our awareness and appreciation for all things Alfred Russel Wallace. So thank you very much. I'm going to clap just because I'm deeply grateful. And I thought I would start the questioning by bringing up the issue of human exceptionalism. So this question of whether human beings enjoyed some special status was certainly present in the 19th century salons and universities where the naturalists were discussing evolution. And it continues to preoccupy us. Franz, you shared with us that periodically some characteristic is posited as being uniquely human, and then about 10 years later, it's debunked. So I'd just like to ask the panel, our speakers, why we seem to be so preoccupied with this enduringly over centuries, and what is the right way to think about human exceptionalism?
Well, I have a little theory about it. Our religions, they arose in the desert, where you had camels and scorpions and snakes and things like that, but not many primates. And so historically, our folklore, for example, has foxes and ravens, and if you look at La Fontaine and people like that, but not primates at all. If you look at Eastern religions, they have lots of primates in their folklore. In China, India, Japan, they all have primates around. So my theory is that we have a religion that arose in a time and place where primates were not prominent or not even known, maybe. When the first apes arrived in the zoos in Paris and London, people were astonished. Queen Victoria called them disgusting, and I think this was a sort of general reaction. People could not imagine that there were animals that looked so much like themselves. And as a result, we installed a soul in humans, and yes, the difference with a camel is pretty big, and so we didn't install a soul in other animals. But in Eastern religions, the soul travels from a frog to a cat to a human very easily. When Darwin's theory came along, which linked us with the primates, there was an enormous amount of objection in our culture, but it has never caused a single problem in Hinduism or Buddhism or nothing. So that's a bit my theory, is that historically, we've had not the connection with primates that would have told us that we're basically animals.
Interesting. You can keep it.
I have an even simpler and more mundane perspective. Which is that we want to think that we're exceptional because we're human, okay? I suspect if this audience was a whole set of elephants sitting around and we were a bunch of elephants, we would be discussing elephantine exceptionalism. I mean, even if we were a bunch of yeast cells sitting around, true, the conversations wouldn't be very interesting. But it's inevitable, it's sort of solipsistic, isn't it? We want to think of ourselves as special. And in a sense, I think that's where Wallace did fall down somewhat. And I do think, and I discussed this morning, one of the reasons, the retrospective reasons we're disappointed in Wallace and why Wallace has been marginalized relative to Darwin. As several people today have said, Darwin, where they disagreed, I'm afraid Darwin tends to have come out on top. And I think this is an absolutely critical instance of that.
Okay, so I also have a question, and this goes back. So we are here to sort of move Wallace out of the shadow of Darwin, right? But he seemed to have been quite happy to be in that shadow. So this remains a bit of a puzzle for me as a historian. I want to really understand this. So we heard about his pathological modesty this morning. But what exactly was the place of this principle of natural selection among all the other things he was doing? How important was it really to him? What place had it among all the causes he was pursuing? And was it maybe also in the way of some of the causes he wanted to pursue?
As I said this morning, again, there is a very marked contrast between the Darwin strategy post-Origin of Species, which is I'm going to do more of the same, I'm going to do it in more depth, and I'm going to elaborate and expand. Whereas Wallace, he comes back from the Malay Archipelago in 1862. He's famous, he's made it, he's connected to Darwin. Yes, he keeps doing a lot of, don't get me wrong, he does a lot of really important science, but he uses his newfound prominence as a springboard to address just about everything. And the irony is, and I think he was aware of it, he wrote in his autobiography, he said, my critics always point to me and say his science is excellent, but when he starts doing anything else, they call me a weak, babyish idiot. And that hurt. And when he was finally awarded, he was very late in getting many honors, but he became a member of the Order of Merit of the British Empire, which was one of these elite, silly British regal things that you get if you've been a good person for long enough. He said, this is ridiculous. They're giving it to me. I'm a firebrand. I'm a radical. I don't identify with this world. So I agree, yes, there are all sorts of things which were as important or more important to him. But then again, you read his autobiography, and he has this touching moment where he's talking about his passion for natural selection. And by the way, his passion for natural selection means no thank you sexual selection. Okay? And he describes himself, and there's real pride there, as more Darwinian than Darwin.
Could you stretch a little more toward the actual differences, as opposed to those that are just centered on egocentrism?
I'm not sure I'm getting this. Eurocentrism, you mean? Or?
No, egocentrism.
Egocentrism. Oh, egocentrism. Yeah, no. I usually divide people in two categories. Also people in the US, everywhere. There are people who love to be compared with animals, and there are people who get very upset. And it's something that starts during adolescence, because you don't find young children who don't want to be compared with animals or hate that. It's some sort of indoctrination that happens during adolescence. And so some people, you say, well, does your dog have emotions? And they describe all the emotions, and they have themselves similar emotions. They have no problem with that, all that connection between human and animal. And there are other people who get extremely upset. It's an indoctrination that starts at a certain age, where you, and this relates to what you said, where you want to set yourself apart, and part of your self-identity becomes that you're human and not animal. And I always wonder why there is this sort of split. Because if you go, for example, to a zoo, you talk to all the volunteers and the keepers at the zoo. And basically everyone who works at the zoo feels that connection, otherwise they wouldn't be at that place. But you go to, let's say, a humanities department, philosophers, people in language and so on, they all feel that they're totally different. They're not animals, and you cannot call them animals because that's an insult.
This is directed to Franz specifically and kind of open, but a few months ago, after the death of Robin Williams, this video surfaced where Coco the gorilla, her caretaker, informed her, because they were friends, and she immediately seemed very distraught. And I really don't know much about the topic, but it seems like this sort of cross-species empathy is sort of a relatively recent thing. So what's the case with that, and do you think the future holds any development for that?
well, I hate to be a spoiler here, but, you know, I'm certainly the promoter of the idea that animals can have empathy and that humans have empathy for animals, and some animals sometimes have empathy for humans. That's all possible, but the case of Coco, the gorilla, is very special. So Coco met Robin Williams 13 years ago for 1 hour or so. It's inconceivable to me that she felt sad because she sort of understood what had happened. I don't think you can explain to a gorilla that someone that she barely remembers died, and what that would mean. We know that primates have reactions to the death of others if they see and feel, and if it's someone close to them, if a mother loses her child, or if even between friends this happens, that they are very affected by the death of someone that they see dead. But to explain the death of someone that is not there and that they haven't seen in 13 years, no, that doesn't work to me. So the Coco story is just a publicity stunt by the Coco Foundation to get money, I suppose, and that has, in my opinion, nothing to do with what Coco can do. But I do believe that animals can have empathy for other species. I've seen that myself. So you may have an attachment between animals, or you may have your dog who is attached to you. That would be maybe the most common example. In that sense, I think there's a connection.
I just wondered when you think anthropomorphism became so ingrained in science, and whether it's just a byproduct of our sense of our egocentric sense and our sense of exceptionalism, and whether you think it's going away a bit.
There is a wonderful case of very pure anthropomorphism in Wallace's writing. He, remember, was a hunter, effectively. I mean, he's collecting, this is Victorian-style collecting, and one of his focal species, we haven't talked about it really today, was the orang. So he killed a lot of orangs, mainly in northern Borneo. And on one occasion, he shot a mother, killed the mother, and the mother was with a juvenile, very young orphan, which he then took on and tried to raise. It was destined to failure because he didn't have access to high-fat content milk. He was feeding it coconut milk and so on. But he did his best. He found another little monkey to be its companion and so on and so forth. It died, and yes, he was attached to this, but I think he got £4 10 shillings for the corpse from the Natural History Museum in London, so it wasn't that sentimental about it. But the anthropomorphism is a wonderful, frankly, and very tongue-in-cheek letter he wrote to his mother about the little baby he'd acquired. And he describes the young orang in completely human terms. And you can imagine poor mum reading it back in England. You know, Alfred's gone off to the wilds, and he's gone wildly native. He's acquired this baby, which is God knows how. He says, and there's this lovely final line, which he sort of blows his cover. It's quite a long letter. He says, and this baby is in many ways the perfect baby, as any mother would say. Every mother believes, or every parent believes their baby is the perfect baby. My baby is a perfect baby, except in one unusual aspect, and being covered in long red hair. But sorry, that really wasn't an answer to your question.
Do you want to say something? No.
You know, I have a question, and this has to do with the birds of paradise. Are they at all endangered now? I mean, they seem to be living in a paradise with isolation and inaccessible rainforests and so forth, but what do we have to worry about now in terms of their future? Is climate change an element? Predation from humans?
So no, predation by humans isn't a major factor. So birds of paradise have been hunted by people, historically and traditionally, but it's really just the males that have the plumes that are hunted. And something we didn't mention is that young males are born looking like females. They don't mature and acquire their adult plumage until they're 4 or 5 years of age. So if you are hunting all the plumed males, there's still other males in the population. So even with extensive hunting from the plume trade, we don't know of populations that have gone extinct from hunting. So really it's It's the same pressures on forests everywhere. Pressures put on forests from natural resource extraction, and of course things like climate change affect species all around the globe, and most birds of paradise are sedentary forest dwellers. Many of them are montane species, and so as temperature and habitat and climate changes in New Guinea, whether it starts shifting up higher in the mountains, in theory there could be less appropriate habitat for some of the higher montane species.
Sure. Yeah, just a question of whether they are endangered. I mean, right now, of the 39 species, there are just 3 of them that are listed on the IUCN Red List, the sort of international standard of listing endangered species. So, although pressures on rainforests in New Guinea are increasing, like right now, we're still in pretty good shape in terms of the habitat for birds of paradise. We're still kind of ahead of the curve. It's not like a panda situation where there's just a few left. So there's still a lot of forest in New Guinea. There's still a lot of habitat for most of the species. The 3 that are endangered and other ones that are near threatened are all the ones that are sort of living in the places where, closest to human exploitation of the forest is shrinking the most. So we really hope that, getting some more attention for birds of paradise will allow, get people interested in setting aside more reserves and protected forests. Because one thing that, both in Papua New Guinea and in the Indonesian part of New Guinea, there are some paper parks kind of in the Indonesian side that aren't really protected. In the Papua New Guinea side, there are very few actual nature reserves. So there's a lot of room for important conservation work to preserve these birds of paradise for the future. But right now we're still in pretty good shape, so that's kind of the good news.